Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Let's Talk Debt webinar. I am Phemelo. I am the Strategic Comms Lead at the New Economy Hub. I am really going to be preaching to the converted here. However, I need to just remind us of the challenges that we're facing. Africa carries more than 746 billion in high interest debt. And this isn't just numbers on a page. It's a system designed to keep our governments paying debt before they pay schools, before they pay hospitals, and before they even create jobs. I recently read Toko Madongo's article, and it was titled Debt Imperialism, The Art of War by Other Means. And she puts it like this: debt is not only a financial mechanism, but it's also a tool of colonialism, English, sorry, designed to keep the continent subservient to foreign interests. And she warns us that we should understand today's global South debt crisis as a neo-imperialist, a form of financial domination in which capital-rich global North wages a low-intensity financial conflict against the South. So the scale is very staggering. Right now, more than 62 developing countries spend over 10% of their revenues on debt payments. And in 46 of those countries, high interest payments are higher than spending on health or education. So these are 3.4 billion lives directly affected. And the cruel truth that this is a form of control that is harder for the global South to change the balance of power or to challenge the financial capitalism. And this is why Money Talks is important. It really helps us to translate deep research of these issues into everyday conversations. It helps us build demand for change and to amplify the voices of those that are calling for debt justice. And we at the New Economy Hub, our work is about building a case-centered, just and inclusive economy, one where policies are informed by evidence, grounded in justice, and shaped by people's lived realities. So today, as part of Money Talk series, we're going to be exploring how advocacy, research, and even business can help shape the urgent fight for debt justice. And most importantly, we will be reminding ourselves that this is about people, it's about dignity, and it's about our shared future. Without wasting more time, we are going to be diving right in. And our first presentation will be coming from Emily Jones from Money Talks and Tuan van der Doch from Stack Data Strategy. So Emily is a communications and projects management professional who works at Black Sense Communication on the Money Talks project. She holds a master's in corporate governance and ethics, and she brings extensive international experience, especially in communications around education, social policy, climate action, as well as sustainability. We're joined by Tuan, who is an associate director at Stack Data Strategy, where he works on data and analytics for political and corporate campaigns. He helps organizations harness insights to inform strategy and has a strong background in Ethiopian politics, climate change, and industrial transformation. So Emily and Tuan will be sharing how new research can help us close the gaps between activists and broaden the public. Because if the public is not with us, debt justice remain an elite conversation. So Emily and Tuan, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thanks, Phemelo, for the introduction. And hello, everyone. Great to have you all here. I'm just going to start sharing some slides, so bear with me. Brilliant. Okay, so yeah, as Phemelo mentioned, today in this session we'll be looking at our Money Talks debt research with a particular focus on the South Africa and the Kenya results. Yeah, first of all, we'll start with a quick intro into Money Talks, which is an open source research project that looks into how to win support for investment in action on climate, nature, and development by changing the way we talk about it. Money Talks started back in 2022 with a survey across G7 countries. The following year, we expanded the research to include 16 countries, including the G7 and some emerging economies. You see the list here in the middle. And in 2024, we focused in on how to win support for tax. This year, we've been focusing on debt. So in April, we ran 6 focus groups. So they were in the UK, South Africa, and the US, followed in May by an online survey of 15,000 people across the 10 countries listed here. So yeah, Tuan is going to talk you through the context and what we found out about public attitudes towards debt, and I'll follow afterwards with what that means for specifically for how we communicate about debt. So over to you, Tuan.
Great. Thanks a lot, Emily. Yeah, I'll do a whistle stop tour through the most important figures, starting with some, I think, very kind of abstract, high level context sketching. We started the entire research process just by asking what people think are the most important issues currently facing them, facing their countries, facing the world. Of course, the answers to that question depend on at what level you encourage respondents or citizens to think. And in this first question that I'm presenting here on this slide, we encourage them to think globally. So what do you think the most important issue is facing the world as a whole? We've asked this year after year in our different studies, and we see that at the headline level across all the countries that we study, there's very little change, right? So climate change is still the top global issue. Most people, or 35% of people, both in 2024 and 2025, ranked it among the 3 most important issues facing the world. In 2025, this was followed by global economic instability and food insecurity and hunger on the second and third place. So just 3 countries didn't place climate change as their top concern this year. Those were the US, Brazil, and South Africa. And to dig into South Africa and Kenya a little bit more, if we flick through to the next slide, as you can see, the picture in South Africa is a little bit different here. There, 44% selected corruption as one of the more important issues facing the world at the moment, followed by 31% for food insecurity and hunger, and 29% for global economic instability. For Kenya, the picture is a little bit closer to what we saw as the kind of global average picture, but again, note the kind of higher level of concern about corruption here on a global scale. We then took a step down and looked at this on a national level. And there we see that priorities shift quite a bit. In fact, the focus is mostly on the economy as a key concern. Now, the country level differences are quite striking here, I would say. If we go to the next slide, there's a lot of data on this slide, presenting quite a diverse picture on the table on the left. You see issues like cost of living, immigration, healthcare, housing, or the economy being top or near the top of the concern list, depending on the exact country that you look at. If you look at South Africa and Kenya, though, they share a very important characteristic here, which is that unemployment ranks as one of the key issues facing the country. So these are important things to keep in mind, I think, when we talk about that specifically, just because there are a lot of pressing issues on people's minds, and whether or not debt is an issue that can speak to those important issues is an important question. So if we look at attitudes to debt specifically, then I think that the baseline for public opinion research on debt should be making the point that, in general, debt is quite an abstract and technical issue that a lot of people will have a limited understanding. I think there's a significant kind of communications challenge there, basically. Overall, we find that just 16% of people across all countries that we surveyed felt that they knew a lot about their country's debt. Now, it was slightly higher in South Africa and Kenya, but we're still not talking about a large part of the population here. Got some quotes on the focus groups on the right, if you like, but these are basically emphasizing the fact that debt as an issue, that I think it is quite a difficult issue to communicate, as I'm sure many of you will be aware of. We then started presenting people with a little bit of information about debt, and we asked them to consider what they thought would be the main reasons why countries have debt in general. And we find that those kind of gut responses often fall into the category of I think, domestic mismanagement in general. So a lot of people would mention poor government financial management or corruption or the misuse of public funds, basically things that have to do with the way countries are run internally. So note that those kind of big figures on the right are all the global averages. In South Africa and Kenya, those figures are even higher. So especially corruption, again, perhaps because this is such a big kind of global concern, is seen as one of the main things kind of driving high levels of debt here. Note that things that have to do with external pressures like economic shocks, unfair lending practices, exploitative pressure from foreign governments, those kinds of things are much less front of mind, I think, if you ask a lot of citizens about the issue of debt. If we flick through to the next slide, there is a kind of an emerging sense that the way we do debt at the moment is unfair, right? So we asked people to pick between a couple of statements, whether poorer countries should pay lower borrowing costs than richer countries, whether poorer countries should pay the same borrowing costs as richer countries, or whether poorer countries should pay higher borrowing costs than richer countries, just to check where the kind of public intuition is there. And overall, this kind of 48% of the public worldwide in this case said that they think that poorer countries should pay lower borrowing costs as they need the loans to invest in development. And another 31% said those costs should probably be the same across rich and poor countries. So that is a significant chunk of the global population here that is at odds with the way that is run right now. So I think that's an important point to start from, showing that basically there is a predominant sense of unfairness in a key tenet of the current system. Then diving specifically into policies, I'll go through a couple of quick stats before I hand over to Emily. But we then asked, okay, let's say a country is struggling with debt, with high levels of debt. Would you support efforts around debt cancellation or debt relief, where kind of you flexibilize the payment terms, kind of a more limited version of debt support in this case? And we find that overall, given a bit of context, 54% of people would support debt cancellation, where all or part of the struggling countries' debt is dropped, and 70% would support debt relief. We then also looked at specific ways of formulating debt debt relief in a conditional sense. So would you support debt if? And then after the if, we asked if it was tied to investing more in public services, or if it was tied to cutting back on public services. And we find that the kind of public investment-led approach here is much more popular among publics worldwide, basically, or across all the countries that we studied. At least 62% overall would support debt relief if it were tied to the country receiving the relief investing more in public services, or in things that we would consider to be good for society in that case. But just 39%, so again, a significant gap there, would support the same thing if it were tied to austerity measures relating to kind of getting public spending under control. Basically, the model that I think currently is quite widespread. There are also some real concerns that I think are important to highlight. We asked people which they think are the strongest arguments against dropping the debt of struggling countries. And you see that the things that come out on top across a lot of countries are that it could encourage reckless borrowing in the future, or that the cost of debt relief could fall unfairly on taxpayers in other countries. So especially these kind of moral hazard type arguments, I think, are important to keep in mind, that this is about tackling real issues, and this isn't about freebies in a way. So let's keep that in mind when perhaps facing opposition to these types of issues. And then, yeah, these stats are similarly reflected among respondents that we interviewed in Kenya and South Africa, potentially even higher on the kind of moral hazard point that I mentioned. And then finally, these are some focus group quotes to kind of illustrate that last point. The person in South Africa saying, you can't just cancel the debt. If you owe someone, you have to pay them back. You took money from me, I also need that money. I think that's a good representation of these types of the kind of common sense kind of gut reaction to a lot of this debate, and I think shows some of the obstacles that communication will have to tackle in first instance. But on how to tackle those obstacles, I will hand it over to Emily.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tuan. Really interesting insights there. So now we are going to look at what all of this means for how we communicate about debt. I'm going to run you through our 5 key insights that are hopefully easy to remember and can help us to win public support. So the first insight is to focus on the positive impact of debt action. So what is it going to achieve? And can you express that in terms of things that people care about most, such as unemployment and economic stability? For example, we asked, which of these types of debt do you generally consider to be a good thing? And you can see that government borrowing to support public services is right up there at the top, globally, as well as for South Africa and Kenya. The second insight is that highlighting emergencies, external crises, and humanitarian needs wins support. It's that sense of events being outside of a country's control and tackling urgent needs that made people really start warming up to supporting action on debt. This is illustrated nicely by this next question here, where we asked, thinking of a country that is struggling with high levels of debt, in which of the following situations would you support cancelling a country's debt? And very few respondents would never support debt cancellation, as we see in the circle on the right there. Our third insight is to shift the narrative from mismanagement and corruption to external emergencies. So there's an opportunity here to shift the narrative from these internal issues such as moral hazard and corruption to those external things that we've seen that people care about, the things outside of a country's control, like emergencies and external shocks. But of course, it's not all about emergencies. There are longer term needs to communicate about as well. So insight 4 is that being pragmatic and emphasizing mutual benefit helps to win support. And this is something we've seen repeatedly throughout Money Talks research, that people generally are pragmatic and common sense. So framing debt relief not as a handout or charity, but as a common sense, strategic investment in growth and global stability helps to build support. Which brings us nicely to our message framing results. So we tested 4 different ways of framing debt relief by asking people which of the following sentences they found the most convincing. So you've got the mutual benefit one, which is debt relief helps everyone. If poorer countries grow, they trade more, create jobs, and reduce the need for aid. For the moral framing, we had some countries are spending money on debt instead of saving lives, educating children, or protecting the environment, which is just wrong. Then we had the common enemy, which was big banks and investors refuse to cut debt even in crises. We need rules to stop them from profiting while others suffer. And finally, the fairness framing. Poorer countries are in debt because of crises they didn't cause. It's only fair that richer countries, who often contributed to these crises, help out. So these are the framings we tested, and we found that the mutual benefit framing came out as the most convincing pretty much across the board. It was also particularly impactful for more skeptical and right-leaning audiences. So therefore, it's a way of appealing to those more hard-to-reach audiences, while also resonating and not alienating more sort of traditional existing supporters. We also found it was effective for convincing debt persuadables, which we defined as people who support debt relief, but not debt cancellation. So imagine they're the ones that could be persuaded to support cancellation as well. A few slides to back this up. So this slide shows the breakdown per country with South Africa and Kenya circled there. And we see here that the mutual benefit framing, the one in green, comes out top in all countries. It also performs well across all age groups, particularly well among older audiences. And as it's a Jubilee year, we looked at how the framings landed for people of faith. And we found that the moral frame works slightly better with religious people than with the general public, but still the mutual benefit frame won out, even in the very religious group at the right-hand end there. So here, we ask people to complete the sentence, I'd support debt relief if the country that is in debt, ... Investing in economic development and job creation was the clear winner. A clear winner here, particularly for respondents in South Africa and Kenya. And this was, here we see this was the case across all age groups in South Africa and Kenya, followed mainly by strengthening democracy and reducing corruption. So here we have the last of our 5 insights, which is to make debt tangible and stress accountability. The scale of the issue can be overwhelming. As Phemelo mentioned at the start, when we saw this in the focus groups, when we presented them with the fact that 54 countries in the world are spending more on debt than on healthcare or education. You combine that with the fact that people don't really trust governments and international institutions to sort it out. It can lead to a sense of defeatism. What can we do? What's the point? It's not going to get solved. It's too insurmountable. But we found when we focused on the opportunities and examples of debt solutions, of things that work and impact citizens' daily lives, that people did start to soften and get their heads around it. Accountability is also really important. We saw that people want lenders to be responsible. And on the flip side of concerns about corruption and financial mismanagement is a desire to know that the money will be well spent. It will be spent wisely. It won't be wasted. It won't be siphoned off. So if there is anything you can do to communicate around that, that could really strengthen support too. So yeah, here's the 5 insights in summary, and also 3 additional points specifically for South Africa and Kenya, which is there's a key opportunity to frame action on debt as a positive tool for unlocking economic recovery, investment, and support. A key challenge is the high concern around corruption and misuse of public funds. But we see that in South Africa and in Kenya in particular, there is a sense that debt can be beneficial if used wisely. So that there's plenty of insights and data to dig into in our research. So there is an interactive dashboard and a longer slide deck for more detail, which has more details and more graphs and so on. But too much information for right now, so we can share those with you after the webinar. So for now, I will stop sharing and we can move on to discussion.
Thank you, Emily and Tuan. That is very insightful. I'm really surprised that more people were not for debt cancellation. Very interesting. We are going to be taking questions for the presentation from Emily and Tuan. We will have 5 minutes. If there is any person who would like to ask something, comment as well, are welcomed. If you don't use this opportunity, we could have an opportunity at the end of all the presentations as well. So if there is no hand, we can move on to our next guest. So our next guest is from the Institute for Economic Justice, Hai Mafaintiri, who will share lessons from creating research tools that not only live on paper, but actually support advocacy and mobilization. Ngeri is an environmental scientist with an interest in climate diplomacy and the just transition movement building, as well as gender justice. She is a registered candidate environmental assessment practitioner in South Africa, and she has contributed to several research publications.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Mude Mafantire, and I'm a junior researcher, climate finance, at the Institute for Economic Justice, which is a progressive think tank based here in Braamfontein, Johannesburg. So my presentation today is supporting advocacy through research. And I'm hoping to take you through the basics and then to share some practical lessons that I've learned through trying to share information and really empower civil society, to empower even activists on just matters relating to climate finance. So climate finance and debt, and how are these two things connected? You'll be hearing me talk a lot about climate finance, and for short, that's CLIFI, and debt. So thank you to the previous presenters who really gave us a really brilliant overview on debt and how it's being perceived in society, and moreover, what it actually is. So how is climate finance connected to debt? Well, the relationship is very straightforward. So every dollar that the Global South spends repaying loans to the Global North is a dollar that is diverted away from investments towards climate finance. That could be in the form of mitigation, adaptation, and climate resilience. And really, when we're talking about climate finance, this is also somewhat of an abstract topic to a lot of people. And ironically, we're still at the point where, yes, the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, they do have a working definition on climate finance, but it is currently being debated because what we are advocating for as members of civil society is a progressive definition of climate finance, one that includes climate finance being grants and not loans. So what does that mean? It means that there is no justice in climate finance if it is in the form of loans, because that simply just locks countries into more debt. And what do I mean by that locks countries into debt? So if we, for example, as South Africa or as any country from the Southern African region, request assistance, it's normally financial assistance from a DFI, is normally in the form of a loan. And these loans have very high interest rates. And fundamentally, it looks like a lot of money on paper, but when you think about it in the long term, what we spend more money doing is paying back the debt. And this limits our ability to achieve sustainable development, let alone respond to the climate crisis, of which Africa is already suffering the most from. So that is the connection between climate finance and debt. So there are two elements of CliFi. You have your social elements and you have your economic elements. So the social elements really speak about the who of it, right? So who is included in climate finance and who is excluded? And when we're speaking about South Africa's just transition, if we're speaking about, for example, in the city, you have His Majesty the King's Just Energy Transition Fund. It is which parties and which stakeholders are being included in the plans and which parties are being excluded. So on a practical level, it means, for example, in South Africa, we're looking at mining workers whose needs were not considered when, for example, Komati was shut down, Komati being a coal mine plant, right? So their needs were not considered. What was mostly considered was the importance of shutting down coal power plants because of the just transition, right? And while it is important to not continue to develop any sort of electricity from coal, what's more important is to ensure the sustainable livelihoods of workers. And we actually launched last week as the Institute for Economic Justice, a worker-centric approach to alternative financing for the just transition. And I hope that a lot of you will visit our website. There's a lot of progressive work on that website. And the second element of CliFi responds to the economic part, right? So the money itself, the mechanisms. Again, grants versus loans versus concessional loans. So it's about the risks, and you'll often hear the term de-risking if we're looking at progressive climate finance. Right? So how do we, and this is where the argument for PPPs comes in. So those are public-private partnerships. Advocacy matters because the work that we do as researchers almost means nothing if it's not able to make actual change. So it's important for us to have impact in spaces such as Parliament. A lot of the work that we do at the IEJ, we have multiple stakeholders who are involved. We have a government so that you have state and non-state actors. However, what's most important is to ensure that people actually benefit positively from our research. And I'll go into the case study, right? If you are joining in from your computer and you have your phone on your hand, you can scan and access this toolkit. This toolkit was developed as part of the Climate Ambition to Accountability project, and it was led by the Institute for Economic Justice. The toolkit in itself, very hefty, very in-depth. What it does is it equips you as a member of civil society, a youth advocate, or just a regular person who has an interest perhaps in the environment. It equips you to understand more about the just transition because it's looking to advocate for rights-based climate investment plans. And that means putting the social before the profit. So there are fact sheets, there are how-to guides. There's a lot in this toolkit. And I'll be sharing some lessons from just using the toolkit to drive the message or the importance of climate finance across the board. So what is climate finance and what is the importance of debt? What does this mean in general? What we need to do is to speak to people on their level and to relate the context to their lived experience. So if we're speaking, for example, to youth, it's really important to know your audience, right? The way in which you're going to advocate for climate finance or to advocate for any sort of sustainable development most accurately is to know who you're speaking to. So if we're speaking to academics, we can use all our fancy terms. And if we're speaking to youth, you understand that you need to use less jargon and you need to make more real life examples, because this is an abstract concept, as I keep mentioning, because a lot of people think it's abstract, but it's on a practical level. This is essentially money that is supposed to help us deal or even respond to climate change. Quite simple, right? And making sure that no one is left behind in the greening of the economy. Even more simple. So what we tried to do last year, once we launched the toolkit, was to find different audiences for the toolkit. And interestingly enough, the people who were most interested were negotiators who negotiate in the Just Transition Work Program stream. So when I say negotiators, I mean people who participate in the UNFCCC processes. So these are primarily negotiation forums. So if you've ever heard people speak about COP, so the people that negotiate are the people who deliberate the text. You'll hear a lot of negotiators speaking about the text. And if you watch any feedback from negotiations, if you maybe heard anything from the June climate meetings, which are known as the subsidiary bodies, or you heard any feedback from COP29, you'll hear people saying the text was weak or the text was strong. No, a strong text is text that is progressive and quite clear on demands that are going to meet the needs of the people and the environment. Weak text sort of shies away from the need to transition away from fossil fuels. And that is the biggest criticism for every COP, is that the text is not strong enough, right? So the people who negotiate under the Just Transition Work Program, this work program was established at COP28, which was held in the UAE, in Dubai. And the point of the Just Transition Work Program is really now, yes, South Africa and a couple of other global South countries have undergone just energy transition partnerships, but it is not something, a just transition is not something that we have defined and really fleshed out fully at the level of the UNFCCC. And we need a framework or a program that other countries who are signatories to the Paris Agreement can be held accountable for. What we don't have is an agreement that all parties that are signatories to the Paris Agreement have come to. So what we have is an informal note that is going to inform the negotiations that are going to take place at COP30 in Brazil. So the people who are negotiating under the Just Transition Work Program, they need this toolkit. A lot of people misunderstand the Just Transition, and that is why it's important for us to keep developing these toolkits. People and institutions and groups, even just interested citizens who are observing the Just Transition, should be producing some sort of research to advocate for more just processes. And this is language that we are making quite clear in this toolkit, but it's language that is necessary for negotiators to understand, because those are the people who have the power to put that into draft text. And finally, what we would hope would be an agreement that is finalized at the upcoming COP, because negotiations can be very technical, but even the technocrats need help from researchers. And it's really just a matter of finding that middle ground where, two different stakeholders can meet each other. And my main message here, because I see Pamela's screen is up, my main message here is just to say that it's important for us to do the research. Yes, it's most important for us to make sure that we are communicating with the right stakeholders in language that they understand, because the toolkit would be not as effective if those efforts to make sure that it's reaching the right people weren't made. So once again, my name is Mudia Mafantiri, and I'm a junior researcher at the Institute for Economic Justice. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it just speaks to the fact that there will not be any dead justice without mass understanding. And if we need to build mass understanding, we need to speak in a way that people will understand. So our next speaker is Khalil Moses from 350africa.org. Khalil is a passionate campaigner for human rights, economic, social, and environmental justice. With over 5 years of local and international experience, he currently serves as a senior campaigner and fair finance expert at 350.org or 350africa.org, where his work focuses on movement for social, climate, and justice. So Khalil is going to help us think about a difficult but necessary question. Could businesses benefit from Africa debt forgiveness? And if so, how do we stop private interest from capturing the fiscal space that debt cancellation should create for the people? Khalil, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Phemelo. Good morning, good evening, everybody. Good afternoon, wherever you're tuning in from. As Phemelo mentioned, I'm going to kind of unpack business and what interests big business has when it comes to African debt forgiveness and global South debt forgiveness, as well as whether we can limit the influence of private interests on the fiscal space, the amount of money that could become available if debt was cancelled. I think we just need to distinguish what and who we mean by business. So if by business we mean large-scale private corporations that control vast sectors of the African and global South economy, then actually under the current economic system of unjust indebtedness, big business have historically benefited. This is because when a country faces unsustainable debt levels, governments are forced to implement austerity policies as conditions, usually of IMF loans. These reforms include cutting government expenditure on things like public services, like education, housing, and healthcare, cutting public sector wages and subsidies on essentials like food and energy. These neoliberal reforms also often include raising taxes on the working class and middle class, while slashing taxes for the wealthy and corporations, big corporations. So these measures are all a part of a neoliberal package of reforms that are forced onto the global South. They usually also include opening our economies to international markets, deregulating sectors like the labor market, and privatizing public services and state-owned companies. So these policies that come as a response to the debt crisis are very clearly pro-rich and pro-big business, as they principally benefit corporations and the wealthy. Companies receive access to power utilities, hospitals, and schools, which they are often able to run and sell for profit. They receive access to cheap labor, exploiting the working class with low wages to help them achieve record profit levels. So clearly, big business are actually benefiting from the status quo. And we need look no further than South Africa, where business has for many years attempted to decouple our state-owned power utility, Eskom, to sell it off for parts, or where the failure of our state to run reliable and adequate public hospitals, clinics, has led to a gigantic private healthcare industry, filling the gap with unaffordable healthcare premiums and for-profit healthcare models. So another example here where it's made clear that big business benefit from the status quo of mass unsustainable debt on the global South is Argentina. So when we succeed in having all unjust, unsustainable debt and forgiveness, debt cancelled and forgiven, this will create huge fiscal space for social development and investment financing. Since 1970, global South governments have paid a staggering $2.2 trillion in interest to global North creditors. So we need to ensure that when that kind of money becomes available for public spending again, it's used to improve the lives of and benefit the many, not increase the profits and the wealth of the few. So here's a quote from the late Fidel Castro, where he basically explains that all debt to imperialist banks is unpayable and immoral. There's some key ways to limit private interests' influence when debt is cancelled, when debt is forgiven, and all of that money is suddenly made available for development investment, we need three things. So on robust anti-corruption and corporate accountability legislation, we need to follow the money and make sure it isn't lost to corruption or misspending. A good example of this is the Fair Finance Coalition of Southern Africa's work on the grant register analysis. So the Just Energy Transition Partnership is a deal, a climate finance deal between the UK, France, Germany. The US used to be a part of this partnership, but when Donald Trump was elected, he pulled out of the deal. So it's between those three European countries who are the donors, and Senegal, South Africa, Vietnam, and Indonesia, who are all the recipients of these funds. So what this grant register analysis did is it pulled information on the development projects funded by the Just Energy Transition Partnership and analyzed whether the money that has thus far been spent actually meets the JETP's development mandate, and analyzes whether there was a misuse or misappropriation of these funds. Another example of how to hold the private interests of corporations at bay, how to keep them at bay, is, like I mentioned, having a principled approach to development financing. So we need clearly defined principles for development, outlining how, on what, and on who the money should be spent. So such principles, I think, should include things like equity, transparency, inclusion, accountability, having a human rights-centered approach, ensuring that it's gender responsive, and adopting a holistic sense to climate justice. I think another key aspect to this is ensuring that in the post-colonial, post-extractive, and post-exploitation world, that the solutions we propose are African-led and African-centered to meet development needs. So the third thing is ensuring development finance institutions' policies actually align with their values and their development mandates, their public development mandates. So another key aspect of work that the Fair Finance Coalition of Southern Africa has done is examine in its biannual policy assessment the DFI policies and determine how effective they are in addressing sustainability and social justice concerns, scoring them basically on a scale of 1 to 5. The better they are at addressing these concerns, the higher their score. What we found over the years is generally development finance institutions that operate in Southern Africa and across the African continent, like the Development Bank of Southern Africa, the African Development Bank, the Industrial Development Corporation, and many others, that these institutions score relatively low on the scale. But what this biannual policy assessment has been able to do is hold them accountable, give them clear ways on how to bring their scores up. And over the years, what we've seen is their scores slowly improving. And actually, these development finance institutions referred to the policy assessment when drafting their policies. Yeah, so that's in a nutshell, basically, how to hold the private interests of corporations at bay. So I'm just going to give some time for questions if there are any, but otherwise over to you, Phemelo.
Thank you, Khalil. You've given us a lot to think about. If you have any questions, now is your time and opportunity. So we are about to close, and I would just love to thank all of our speakers, Emily, Tuan, Mudieri, Khalil, for your amazing contributions. Our host, Mobilize, thank you so much for arranging this and giving this work a platform as well. And so today we have seen that debt is not just a technical issue. It's not just for economists. It is about making research accessible and turning it into an advocacy tool. and protecting the gains so that people can be served and not for private capture, as Khalil has indicated. And again, this is why Money Talks matters. It's that it gives us the tools to do that. It gives us the tools to communicate efficiently in a way that it connects. I mean, for me personally, debt cancellation, the call for debt cancellation seems more powerful and more relevant. However, the masses do not feel that way. And so we can't then take personal feelings or knowledge and push them. We should hear what people are saying and communicate in a way that will connect with them. And so at a New Economy Hub as well, we just committed to building an economy that puts care, dignity, and people justice as the center. So it's very important to have these views as we are constructing advocacy programs for debt justice. This is an opportunity to have your say. We have a few more minutes. Have your say. Have a question or two if you do.
I would just like to say, I think that the issue of debt is something that we do need to continue to try and communicate to the masses, like you said, because I don't think it's just common knowledge just how deeply in debt, different African countries are and how much of our money is going towards servicing debt instead of servicing development of our own countries and our own communities. And when I look at, the changes that happened in the NGO space after these mass funding cuts, to me, the obvious answer seems to be debt cancellation. And that is how we can finance our just transitions. We can finance the energy transition. We can finance responses to hunger. We can finance responses to just energy access problems by canceling debt. And again, just to refer everyone, worker-centric approach to financing the just transition. It's on the IEJ's website. Please check it out. We've made it in layman's language. There are policy briefs and detailed jargon, but the worker-centric workbook, it's just 20 pages and explains all of this. But I think you can expect to start hearing more about debt and debt justice because that's the only way out. Yeah.
Emily, I'd love for you to just jump in. I am in total agreement with what Mudir is saying, is that like the obvious thing to say, to advocate for is debt cancellation. However, your research is saying that 70% of the people that you spoke about too have said that not debt relief would be better, or they would be leaning towards debt relief. So how do you then advise advocacy around this matter?
Yeah, first I want to say I absolutely agree with you. The fact that raising awareness that there is an issue, at least on a global scale, is really important. And I think that there is a debt crisis, and making people aware of what that is and what that means is a really important first step on that sort of general public platform, obviously. And the more people in the industry know that's the case, but if you're looking at the general public, that's a really important first step. And then the debt relief versus debt cancellation question. I think there was, what we saw in the research is that there's concerns around debt cancellation about what the impacts of that might be. I think if you're looking at a general public, you could start off with debt relief and not push them as you grow their understanding of what this actually means. You can then, a good chunk of them, you could then push towards agreeing and supporting debt cancellation. So I think it's an area where you could, aim yourself at those people supporting debt relief and try and bring them across with you. And then that's really quite a large chunk of people, at least from the research that we did, there's a large chunk of people that you could try and move across to supporting debt cancellation.
And I guess also just communicating why Africa is so indebted as well. Having education behind that would be of value, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Why, and then also the impact of it. So what does that mean that the countries are in debt? And I think at the moment there's some discussion is that if the countries are not actually defaulting on their debt and they are paying their debt back, is there a problem? The answer is yes, absolutely, because the speaker said in this webinar already that money is going to repay debt rather than being used on things that the citizens need, education, healthcare, infrastructure, and so on. So there is a problem, and what that actually means for people, people's daily lives, I think is a really it's something that resonates with people in the general public as well. So yes, why, but also what impact that has is really an important one to get across.
Khalil, would you perhaps jump in on this conversation?
Yeah, I think perhaps also the problem is that we've been focusing a lot on I think like you've both alluded to the bigger picture. So what debt forgiveness, debt cancellation can do for um, the economy of a country at state level, but not enough on what it could do for an individual, the average working class person living in that country. You know, and I think that's also why I wanted to reframe the question around what kind of business can benefit from debt cancellation, because I think big business has a vested interest in maintaining indebtedness in the global south, because they benefit from all of the neoliberal reforms that come with or come as a result of indebtedness and austerity. But I think small businesses, for example, could really benefit. There could be a boom of small businesses across global south economies, where suddenly the working class have disposable income and free capital. You know, they could really benefit from governments prioritizing small businesses, controlling prices, breaking up corporate monopolies, using state subsidies to kickstart new businesses and support existing ones. I think we saw this during COVID with with all of the state support for businesses during the pandemic, knowing that because they weren't able to operate as usual, they were going to lose a lot of money, and how important it was for the state to intervene. I think like seeing how what kind of role the state could take in supporting the everyday person, the small mom and pop shop on the corner. Yeah, but I think that's something we really need to lean into and look at. I think also unpacking and explaining, like what you were mentioning, Phemelo, like the historical context behind it. It isn't just that African nations have borrowed, it's that many African nations have been actually forced into indebtedness through their through their independence from being a colony. You know, some countries had to pay their colonizers money back, reparations for the fact that they were no longer going to be a colony. You know, I think of like countries in West Africa. Haiti is a good example of this as well. I think they only broke even on the amount that they still owed to France in the 80s or the 90s. And only then were they able to start taking all of that money and reinvesting it back into their own economy and their own people.
Yeah.
So really providing the context and showing that debt has, it's not as simple as I have agency, I am fully aware of the consequences of borrowing, and therefore and then I borrow, but that we as global South countries are often forced into situations where where we didn't want to borrow, but we had to, or we just were given debt by virtue of existing, you know, and fighting for our independence.
Sure. There is another question about what happens if a country or a government decides not to pay. I think when I read that question, I was like, GDP sinking. And when the GDP sinks, you have no investors, and therefore you have no room to grow your economy as a country. And so, what would your response be to a government that says, listen, this is too much, and I need more schools, I need more hospitals, I need to be creating jobs, and I'm going to take this money that I should be paying this debt and reinvest it.
Yeah, it's tricky because, like you said, the creditors in that situation would then just drive up interest rates. Inflation would then go up. I'm not an economist like Mudi here. I'm more of an environmental scientist, so my sense of the real technical explanation of exactly what kind of fallout would result isn't like fully in depth, but it would have a really dire effect on the economy. And so I think countries that want to stop spending all of their money on servicing loan payments and servicing interest can't do that by themselves. They need to be emboldened by the creditor, by the nation who has given the loan in the first place. Like the problem with the global economy is that you as a nation can't do something like that by yourself because we would need support from the global north. So I think it's really key to build alliances. And in our campaigning work, our debt justice campaigning work, not to just do it here in the global south, but also in the global north, because we need their support. We need them to also lobby their nations to support debt restructuring, debt forgiveness, and debt cancellation. So in the eventuality where we stop paying and servicing our loans and interests on those loans, that we're not then hit with increasing interest rates or mass inflation or other kinds of economic punishments by the global north.
There are a few comments in the chat that I'd love us to engage with. The first one says defaulting will result in negative credit rating. Yes. So it will lend such a country in future. It can also attract international sanctions, thus affecting trade, yes, and access to foreign market, particularly in the global north. And then there is Wendy, we're saying, hi everyone, thanks for the presentations. Quick question. If wealthy countries cancelled a significant portion of Africa's debt tomorrow, rather than just restructuring it, what safeguards would ensure this freed up money goes toward a just transition instead of disappearing into other priorities? That's a good one. Also just disappearing in corruption activities, because we are in Africa.
Yeah, and that is a really good question, right? South Africa is a good example of that, where corruption is rife across the nation, not just in government, but not just in national government, but also in our local government and in the private sector as well. And that's where really robust anti-corruption legislation comes into play, and emboldening watchdogs to ensure that the money goes to where it should be, where it should, and that it's not lost along the way or misappropriated or misused. I think also, like I mentioned earlier, what we really need is clear, defined principles on how we invest money in development. Who do we want it to benefit? How can we make sure that communities are involved in the process? How can we make sure that development finance addresses human rights issues, that it is just for the climate, that like Lundiwe is mentioning, that it aids a just energy transition, a just transition, rather than increasing the profits of big corporations. So I think really having a clear principled approach and having policies and legislation in place that supports that is really important.
Nobisita goes on to say, and defaulting will not necessarily translate into debt disappearing. Rather, there will be more penalties through more interest rates. So if you do not, if you default, it's more dire than you just paying it off. And so that's why it's so important to have a structured cancellation of debt overall, and priorities. Once we have freed up that freed up money, I think priorities should go to social justice work across the board, health, education, employment, and the just transition. So we as just transition advocates or climate advocates should know that before we think about the environment and sustainability, we're in a place where it's about the bread and butter, and those things are very important for people to live and to be healthy and to be educated. And then it infiltrates on other things as well. I think we are at
Pamela, can I just add something before you close? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay, just to answer Landiwe's question. So fundamentally, what would need to happen is to, reframe the macroeconomic policy, like in terms of South Africa. So that is how we would ensure that finance so money that's being freed up actually goes towards a just transition. So there's a lot of changes that would have to happen in the fiscal space. For example, one of the recommendations that we have would be allocating 50% of carbon tax towards financing the just transition, and even the general fuel levy. And actually, this gets more technical. So it's in the publication that I suggested.
Very, very interested in what Nigeria had to say. However, we can just move on because of time. You can go on our website. The tool that the MoneyTalks tool is on our website. All three of them, including the debt one. And they have a dashboard that is very interactive, that you can just go in there, understand what people are saying, how people understand this work, and how to engage with them better as an activist. The tool is very fun and very user-friendly as well. And so you are more than welcome to just go in there and play with it so that you can have advocacy that is relevant to the research that has been done. So there is research that has been done on your behalf regarding debt justice activism. And so, again, really, really appreciate all of our presentations and the insightful conversations. Really appreciate everybody who attended. And Mobilize, thank you so much for opening this platform for us. And have a great afternoon, everybody. And thank you for joining us.